Hello everybody, it's Amber. Welcome back to my channel. It's a couple days before Remembrance Day and I actually wanted to do something a little bit different, and I thought that I would look up some ghost stories from like that kind of time, whether it was stuff that was more modern day about soldiers in the past. But I actually was really surprised, and I found an article that is actually 5 paranormal events experienced by troops in World War I. And I mean, like, actually written events of these troops during the time that they were serving. So all of these veterans who have recounted, or the diaries that they've actually found from all of these soldiers, and just recounting all of these tales. So I thought I would read these out to you. Apparently there are like a lot more, and it's really easy to find them if you go and look for certain books, certain diaries, and that kind of thing. But we have a very limited resource center here for our library in terms of that kind of stuff. So it would have been really hard for me to go and actually get like physical copies of these stories in full. So I'm just going to read you the ones from this article, and I hope you enjoy them. And yeah, just keeping in mind that these are like actual accounts of supernatural things happening during the war. And actually none of these I've ever heard before. So that's actually really cool to me. The disappearance of the 5th Norfolk Regiment at Gallipoli. Known as the Sandringhams due to all the members being employed on the British Royal Estate, E Company of the 5th Norfolk Regiment were formed from a personal request by their employer, King Edward VII, in 1908. Over 100 part-time soldiers joined the company, made up of estate workers, led by the King's land agent Frank Beck. The company were soon in action, deployed to the Dardanelles campaign in August 1915, and taking place in their very first battle on the 12th of that month. However, by the end of that day, all members of the Sandringhams had disappeared without a trace. The whole regiment suffered heavy losses. However, no trace remained of the Sandringhams at all. No bodies, no prisoners, nothing. 50 years later, 3 veterans claimed to have witnessed the supernatural disappearance of the 5th Norfolk Regiment. They claimed to have watched 6 or 8 loaf-shaped clouds form and then hover over the area of the battle, just as the advancing troops marched into it, stating that the clouds slowly rose up about an hour later and no trace of the soldiers were ever seen again. Sounds a little odd to me, but when you go through the rest of these stories and kind of hear all of the things that happened, it makes sense that there was all of this supernatural stuff going on. Now, they still have not found any trace of any of these men. They still have no idea what happened to them, which is just even weirder. Like, how did all of these men, and I mean, there's a lot of them. There is a picture sitting in front of me, and there's probably about 20 of them. Every single one of them disappeared. Without a trace. Gone. Nothing. Nobody's heard from them. So that's actually really creepy to me, that just this gigantic group of people that were going into battle are now gone for good. And that's a lot of like closure for their family that they don't have at all, or for their spirits. I mean, who knows what happened to them or where they are, what's going on in that thing. Maybe they'll come back in 2 years and they'll wonder what happened to time. The next story is the Angel of Mons. During the Battle of Mons in 1914, what looked like certain defeat and further huge loss for the life of the British and Allied forces was temporarily averted when the German cavalry suddenly retreated from one part of the battlefield for no apparent reason, giving the Allies a chance to take cover themselves. Word spread quickly among the troops that angel-like apparitions had appeared between the 2 opposing sides, shielding the British and terrifying the Germans into retreat. The English newspaper, the Daily Mail, reported on an interview with a Private Robert Clever of the 1st Cheshire Regiment, who had purportedly been at Mons and saw the supernatural visions for himself. Suddenly, the vision came between them and the German cavalry. He described it as a flash. Whether or not the soldiers were saved by angels that day, it no doubt gave them and their worried relatives back home a tremendous moral boost in the face of extreme difficulties. I have a lot that could be said about random flashes of light out of nowhere, but that's a whole nother story. Again, like I said, when you look at what happened in the first one versus this one, it kind of makes sense that weird things were happening. Energy was on an all-time high. There was a lot of things swirling around in the atmosphere when all of this was happening. So who knows what could have happened? And I mean, I don't think any of these guys would have a reason to lie about any of it. The third one, and it's one that I saw come up the most, is called Canadian Soldier Saved from Certain Death by His Lost Brother. Now, this one, I think, is probably the most well-known story out of everything that you can search about Remembrance Day ghost stories. And it's actually published in a book. It's of Corporal Will Bird. And he actually took his entire diary and published it as a book. And this account is in there in far more detail. This is just kind of an overview of it. Corporal Will Bird, a soldier in the 42nd Battalion of the Canadian Black Watch, was asleep with some comrades on the floor of their dugout near Vimy Ridge, when Corporal Bird was awoken by 2 warm hands on his back. The last face he expected to see was that of his dead brother Steve, who had been killed in action 2 years earlier. Not speaking aloud, but beckoning Corporal Bird to follow him, Steve led his astounded brother out of the dugout and to a bombed-out ruin on the edge of the battlefield, where he promptly then disappeared. Overcome with exhaustion and emotion, Corporal Bird collapsed into a deep sleep before waking several hours later to resume his place in line. However, when he arrived, he discovered that the bunker he and his comrades had been asleep in had been destroyed by an enemy shell, killing all those left inside. There was no doubt in Corporal Bird's mind that his dearly departed brother had returned that night to save him from the same fate. That one literally sends me chills. It's crazy because there are accounts of this happening everywhere. Loved ones coming and saving people from like certain death and warning them that something is going to happen, or warning them that like natural disasters are happening. And to think that he actually had his brother show up and escort him away from where he would have had his life ended, and that he made it home at the end of all of this is just incredibly heartwarming. And I definitely believe that his brother was watching out for him that day. The next story is probably another one of those ones that everybody has heard about. I mean, I think we've all seen Snoopy as the Red Baron flying around and everything. But this story is actually from the First World War about the Red Baron. And it's titled, "The Red Baron Shot Down a UFO Over the Trenches." Now, I think if you've heard the story of the Red Baron, you know that he was a really famous airman of the First World War. So the story goes as this. The most famous airman of the First World War was the Red Baron, Manfred Freiherr von Richthofen. I don't know if I'm saying that right at all. I have a really hard time pronouncing anything German in my life. He was revered and feared by other pilots, who could not equal his airborne skills. Perhaps less well known about this flying ace, though, is the story that he supposedly shot down a UFO over the Belgian trenches in early 1917. Reported as an upside-down silver saucer with orange lights by witnesses and a fellow fighter, Ace Peter Watzrick. Even more incredibly, there were more purportedly survivors as 2 occupants were seen to jump out of the crashed craft and run into the trees. Despite the story being widely questioned, Watrick was convinced he had seen a UFO and that the Red Baron had shot it down over the battlefields. So not only did he apparently shoot down an aircraft, 2 beings got out of it and ran into the Belgian woods. I'm sorry, but I don't think that somebody would literally lie about this in the moment to get attention back then. I mean, there's just a lot of things that I don't think would have happened, really. I don't. I don't think people would have lied back in the 1900s about anything like that. If people saw stuff, they saw stuff. And I mean, that's when a lot of our fairy tales and folklore comes from, is like the 1900s and earlier. So that's a little weird. Maybe if you're ever wandering through the Belgian woods, you should keep an eye out for aliens, because apparently 2 of them ran off and we don't know what happened to them. Or this ship, for that matter. If they did actually shoot down a UFO, where is it now? Maybe that's something for somebody to figure out. The last story that I'm going to read you guys is called The Ghost Cavalry. This one I thought was actually really, really touching and really cool because there are so many stories of this happening in other places and in the States as well. So, the story goes, when the guns finally fell silent in 1918, James Wentworth Day, later to become a famous broadcaster and writer, was accompanied by a Corporal Barr on a mission to collect post and rations before returning to their camp. They walked past a wood where trees had been disfigured by shell blasts, and as they drew alongside it, ghostly German cavalrymen swept out of the trees and charged towards a spectral vision of French troops on the other side of the wood. Not quite knowing what they were seeing, the men waited for the clash of swords or gunfire, but none came. Only silence and a vision of empty devastation all around them. The men agreed they'd both seen something mighty queer, but said no more about it and reached camp again soon after. The next day, Wentworth Day asked a peasant in the nearest village about the wood. "Ah, monsieur, that is a wood of dead men. The cavalry of France and Germany have always met each other by that wood." And the man took Wentworth Day to see the graves that stood in the tiny churchyard of all the cavalry lost in those terrible wars. It's something to be said. You hear it all the time about like the battlefields of the Civil War where you can go out there and you can hear the sound of guns firing, you can hear swords, you can hear men yelling, and you can just hear and feel the like energy and the charged atmosphere of that whole time period. So I think it's really interesting that these men were experiencing something that had actually only happened like 2 years prior, potentially even just a few months before they showed up to walk to the nearest place. I think these stories make it all very real that it was still happening to them. Even in the midst of all these terrible, terrible situations, there was either something looking out for them by allowing them to escape, or people to escape death, or, maybe not necessarily actually die. There have been so many stories from other wars about, ghostly apparitions dragging people who've been injured to safety, or just random things like that. Or, somebody coming in and warning them that something is going to happen so they have time to react, but this person didn't actually exist. I think it's really cool, and I'm really happy that I found stories like this because I think it's something that is not widely talked about on the internet or in general. Remembrance Day happens and we give our thanks for all of the soldiers who fought in the war, and we have our assemblies and our ceremonies, and it's a big thing all over the nation. And in its own right is just a heavy day for a lot of people, but there's no exploration into the things that actually happened aside from, you know, the documentaries about Vimy Ridge, or the, you know, everybody always reads In Flanders Fields, which I know I did in like elementary school. That was something that we did at the ceremony. And, you know, we lay the wreaths, we wear our poppies for the month of November, and just all of these things that we do for these soldiers. But I think a lot more light needs to be shed on the things that they did for us, the things that were achieved by the end of this war, and how the world in general has progressed, not only from World War I, but to all of our wars that we've fought throughout history that maybe didn't affect everybody in the world, but still affected the world. And yeah, I think we just need to learn how they live their lives, and how, you know, supernatural tales like this were so normal for them. I know I have lots of family members who proudly serve. I just wanted to say I hope everybody has a very peaceful Remembrance Day, that I hope you have nice and calm experience wherever you end up being for your ceremony in your town. And thank you to all of our past and present soldiers that are still currently serving our country, as well as thank you to our veterans alive as well as passed away. You have done so much service for our country, and we can't thank you enough. If you guys liked what you heard in this video, please hit the like button, click the subscribe button, turn on the notifications. I do upload a new video every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And until next time, have a good night, guys.